All right. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, Facebook. Shabbat Shalom. Everybody here at Shema Israel 7 Ministry Congregation here in Colorado. Today I'm going to be preaching on what is Hanukkah. But before we do that, like always, let's blow the shofars. Have a word of prayer. So if you have your shofars out there, please blow it with me. All right. Count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Amen. All right, let's pray. Avinu Shabbat Shamayim, Father in heaven, Abba, thank you for this glorious day, this Shabbat that you have set apart for us, this time where we can just dig into your word and fellowship with one another and come together as a body in Messiah. Abba, I pray that you'll guide my lips today as we go through the Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah. Abba, that I will bring a light to what it means, and that'll be a blessing to all those who listen. I pray that you guide my thoughts and my lips as I cover this topic. I pray these things in his precious name. Amen. All right, so what is Hanukkah? That's with Hanukkah coming up shortly. I think it's good that we cover what is Hanukkah, what the traditions are, and how we should keep it, and what we should take away from this feast that is not one of the specific moeds, one of Yah's set apart feasts that we're commanded to keep. So with that said, according to Merriam-Webster, I'm just going to start with the outright definition of what Hanukkah is. And Merriam-Webster says it's an 8-day Jewish holiday beginning in the 25th of Kislev and commemorating the rededication of the Temple of Jerusalem after its defilement by Antiochus of Syria. So the 25th of Kislev. What day is the 25th of Kislev? This all depends on what calendar you're following. If you're following the crescent moon calendar, Hanukkah will start at sunset next Shabbat and go till the following Sunday, the sundown the following Sunday. So the 29th, from the 21st to the 29th. If you're following conjunction, this will be a day earlier, so the 20th to the 28th. And if you're following the Jewish Hallel calendar, it'll be a day later, so that'll be from the sunset on Sunday the 22nd to Monday evening the 30th. And this is when, the majority of the Jews will celebrate Hanukkah. So with that said, the word Hanukkah itself comes from the Hebrew root word, which is Chanak, Strong's H2596, which means to dedicate and train up. And as we probably already know, Hanukkah is also known as the Feast of Dedication or the Festival of Lights. But I think in order to get a full understanding of what Hanukkah is and how we should celebrate it, I think it's important that we understand the events that led up to the situation that happened that caused them to rededicate the temple. So the events that made Hanukkah. Okay. Now, I'm going to be reading a lot from the book of Maccabees. the first book of Maccabees and the second book of Maccabees. And you may not have that in your Bible, depending on what Bible you have. It's part of the Apocrypha text, which was originally in the King James Bible, but then was taken out. And some people have put it back. The Catholics have put it back in their Bible, but the Protestants kept it out, so it's not a part of most of the Bibles we have today. But if you're welcome to download or follow along if you have the Maccabees. I'm going to start in 1 Maccabees 1, and I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Edition, NRSV version. And it starts, after Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributary to him. So, this is talking about Alexander the Great. And this map here shows basically his territory, what he had conquered. It's all the colored areas are basically what he had controlled, and what would later be divided up to his leaders or his generals. They divided the land after he died, or right before he died. But I think it's important to understand that he had land. He was occupying Jerusalem or Israel. However, Yah had given favor to the Israelites with him. So, and we know this by what Josephus says. So, in this is a summary of Josephus, which is a summary of the events. So, this is from the Jewish Encyclopedia, and it says, the only historical event connecting Alexander the Great with the Jews is his visit to Jerusalem, which is recorded by Josephus in a somewhat fantastic manner. According to Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, chapter 8, verses 4 through 6. Alexander went to Jerusalem after having taken Gaza. Judah the high priest had a warning from Elohim received in a dream, in which he saw himself vested in a purple robe with his mitre, and had the golden plate on which the name of Elohim was engraved on his head. Accordingly, he went to meet Alexander at Saphah, the view of the temple, followed by the priests, all clothed in fine linen, and by a multitude of citizens. Judah awaited the coming king. When Alexander saw the high priest, he reverenced Elohim and saluted. I guess that's actually Jaddua. Sorry, I've been saying it wrong. Jaddua was the name of the high priest. Jaddua, while the Jews with one voice greeted Alexander. When Parmeno, the general, gave expression to the army surprise, Alexander's extraordinary act, since he had saluted the high priest, that one who ought to be adorned by all as king should adore the high priest of the Jews. Alexander replied, I did not adore him, but the Elohim who hath honored him with this high priesthood, for I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who when I was considering with myself how I might obtain dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea, promising that he would conduct my army and would give me dominion over the Persians. Alexander then gave the high priest his right hand and went into the temple and offered sacrifice to Elohim according to the high priest's direction, treating the whole priesthood magnificently. And when the book of Daniel was shown to him, wherein declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that he was the person intended, and rejoiced thereat. The following day, Alexander asked the people what favors he should grant them, and at the high priest's request, he accorded them the right to live in full enjoyment of the laws of their forefathers. He furthermore exempted them from the payment of tribute in the 7th year of release. To the Jews of Babylonia and Media also he granted like privileges, and to the Jews who were willing to enlist in his army he promised the right to live in accordance with their ancestral laws. So here we see that back in the time of Alexander the Great, Yah showed favor to the Israelites and came to Alexander in a dream that he would encounter the high priest, and that by Yah's doing that he was to honor them, and he gave them favor. He gave the Israelites favor because of it. And just an example of what he would have read in Daniel could have been Daniel 8 to verses 20 through 22, which says, "The ram which you saw, having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat of the kingdom of Greece, or is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between the eyes of the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms that shall arise out of the nation, but not with its power." So while the Jews were under occupation by the Greeks, they were still allowed to fully practice the Torah. And that was a huge blessing to the people of Israel. Now, continuing on in Maccabees, starting at 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 5, it says, and this is talking about Alexander the Great again. It says, "After this he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died." So here again, we see that he brought his officers and divided the kingdom up according to the officers. And that's why we have this map, and we have the different officers having different areas of his kingdom. And continuing in verse 8, "Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their descendants after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. From them came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. He had been a hostage in Rome. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks." So, while Alexander the Great, gave favor to the Israelites, his successors did not necessarily feel the same way or uphold the statutes that he had decreed. And from there we have Antiochus Epiphanes. From here I want to jump to 2 Maccabees chapter 4, verses 7 through 17. So in 2 Maccabees chapter 4, starting in verse 7, it says, When the Seleucids died, and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption. So this is now talking about Onias at the time when Antiochus Epiphanes was ruler. Onias was the high priesthood, or high priest in Israel. But when after he died, Jason, his brother, obtained the high priesthood by corruption, promising the king at an interview 360 talents of silver, and from another source a revenue 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it, and to enroll the people of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. When the king assented, and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his compatriots over to the Greek way of life. So, because Antiochus Epiphanes was the ruler over the area, he controlled who could be high priest. And because he controlled who could be high priest, Jason bought the position of high priest. And then because Jason was already, in a way corrupted, he was willing to buy the position of high priest, which shouldn't have been allowed anyway. He had ulterior motives for Jerusalem. He wanted to Hellenize the Jerusalems, bring the entertainment that he thought, was pleasurable to the people, and basically just Hellenize the Jerusalem, make them follow the Greek way of life. Continuing in verse 11, he set aside the existing royal concessions to the Jews, secured through John, the father of Eupolemus, who went on the mission to establish friendship and alliance with the Romans. And he destroyed the lawful ways of living and introduced new customs contrary to the law. He took delight in establishing a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of young men to wear the Greek hat. There was an extreme of Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no true high priest. That the priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar, despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the signal of the discus throwing, disdaining the honors prized by their ancestors and putting the highest value upon Greek forms of prestige. For this reason, heavy disaster overtook them and those whose ways of living they admired and wished to imitate completely because their enemies, wished to imitate completely, became their enemies and punished them. It is no light thing to show irreverence to the divine laws, a fact that later events will make clear. So Jason had now corrupted the priesthood, and it started leading people astray. So I'm going to continue again back into 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 11. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us. For since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us." This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision and abandoned the holy covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. So, in First Maccabees, this is kind of a summary of what happened because of Jason's corruption, taking the priesthood and leading people astray, building the gymnasium. And the crazy thing is they were even removing the marks of the circumcision. They were trying to reverse the circumcision because the games that they would play in the gymnasium, the events they would have, basically the Olympics kind of thing, they would do naked. So showing that you were, had that mark, I don't know, it was looked down upon according to the Gentiles. So the Jews wanted to be like the Gentiles. Okay. So, but what goes around with Jason, comes around. So 2 Maccabees, I'm going to jump back to 2 Maccabees here, chapter 4, 23 through 26. After a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon, to carry the money to the king and to complete the records of essential business. But he, when presented to the king, extolled him with an air of authority and secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. After receiving the king's order, he returned possessing no qualification for the high priesthood, but having the hot temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage wild beast. So Jason, who after supplanting his own brother was supplanted by another man, was driven as a figure into the land of Ammon. So, by the same methods that Jason used to take control of the high priesthood, Menelaus did the same thing to him. And this is what happens when we let that position just be open to money, really. Like people can just buy that position. It's not Yah's appointed person leading the people. All right, so going back to 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 16 through 19. When Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established, he determined to become king of the land of Egypt, in order that he might reign over both kingdoms. So he invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots and elephants and cavalry, and with a large fleet. He engaged King Ptolemy of Egypt in battle, and Ptolemy turned and fled before him, and many were wounded and fell. They captured the fortified cities in the land of Egypt, and he plundered the land of Egypt. So again, on this map, the Seleucid kingdom, he came down and was conquering the Ptolemaic kingdom that he's taking King Ptolemy on. Now, because of all the fighting and what happened, there was some confusion that arose. And 2 Maccabees, I'm going to turn again to 2 Maccabees, this time chapter 5, verses 5 through 20, which says, when a false rumor arose that Antiochus was dead, Jason took no fewer than 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault on the city. That's Jerusalem. When the troops on the wall had been forced back, and at last the city was being taken, Menelaus took refuge in the citadel. But Jason kept relentlessly slaughtering his compatriots, not realizing that success at the cost of one's kindred is the greatest misfortune, but imagining that he was setting up trophies of victory over enemies and not over compatriots. He did not, however, gain control of the government. In the end, he only got disgrace from his conspiracy and fled again into the country of the Ammonites. Finally, he met a miserable end, accursed before Artas, the ruler of the Arabs. Fleeing from city to city, pursued by everyone, hated as a rebel against the laws, and abhorred as the executioner of his country and his compatriots. He was cast ashore in Egypt. There he who had driven many from their own country into exile died in exile, having embarked to go to the Lacedaemonians in hope of finding protection because of their kinship. He who had cast out many to lie unburied had no one to mourn for him. He had no funeral of any sort and no place in the tomb of his ancestors. When news of what had happened reached the king, that's Antiochus, he took it to mean that Judah was in revolt. So, raging inwardly, he left Egypt and took the city by storm. He commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to kill those who went into their houses. Then there was massacre of young and old, destruction of boys, women, and children, and slaughter of young girls and infants. Within the total of 3 days, 80,000 were destroyed, 40,000 in hand-to-hand fighting, and as many were sold into slavery as were killed. So, because of the actions of Jason, that enraged Antiochus, and he came in and basically wanted to put down any kind of revolt or things that were happening, and basically really wanted to separate himself or separate that country from anything Jewish. So like more corruption, which caused more problems, which ultimately caused many people to be killed. All right, continuing in verse 15. Not content with this, Antiochus dared to enter the most holy temple in all the world, guided by Menelaus, who had become a traitor both to the laws and to his country. He took the holy vessels with his polluted hands and swept away with profane hands and votive offerings that other kings had made to enhance the glory and honor of the place. Antiochus was elated in spirit and did not perceive that the Lord was angered for a little while because of the sins of those who lived in the city, and that this was the reason he was disregarding the holy place. But if it had not happened that they were involved in many sins, this man would have been flogged and turned back from his rash act as soon as he came forward, just as Heliodorus had been, whom King Seleucus sent to inspect the treasury. So this is another story I just kind of left out that's in the Maccabees as well. But Jehovah did not choose the nation for the sake of the holy place, but the place for the sake of the nation. Therefore the place itself shared in the misfortunes that befell the nation, and afterward participated in its benefits, and that was forsaken in the wrath of the Almighty, was restored again in all its glory when the great Lord became reconciled. Okay, so I'm going to turn back to Maccabees chapter 1, 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 20. Did anybody have any questions are you guys following it all? Okay, so I know it's kind of confusing, and I think interweaving the books of Maccabees, or the Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2, or 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees, I think kind of puts the story together better. Okay, so going back to 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 20. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year. He went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. So this is, again, since we just read this in 2 Maccabees, we're now reading what 1 Maccabees had to say about it. He took also the table of the bread of the presence, the cups for the drink offering, the bowls, the golden censers, and curtain and crowns, and the gold decoration on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. It does say here that he arrogantly entered and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. Okay, just remember that part. 23, he took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He took also the hidden treasures that he found. Taking them all, he went into his own land. He shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint. The beauty of the women faded. Every bridegroom took up the lament. She who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning. Even the land trembled for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. So 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the land, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, and tore it down, its houses and its surrounding walls. They took captive the women and children and seized the livestock. Then they fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. They stationed there a sinful people, men who were renegades. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem, they stored them there and became a great menace. For the citadel became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil adversary of Israel at all times. On every side of the sanctuary they shed innocent blood. They even defiled the sanctuary. Because of them, the residents of Jerusalem fled. She became a dwelling of strangers. She became strange to her offspring, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary became desolate like a desert. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into reproach, her honor into contempt. Her dishonor now grew as great as her glory. Her exaltation was turned into mourning. So again, because she, Jerusalem played the harlot with the Greeks, with the Greek gods and their ways. This is the result of what happened. The temple was destroyed. Her glory was no longer. It was turned into shame. All right, continuing in verse 41. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted this command of the king. Many even from Israel gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the town of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for altars, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were made themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. In such words, he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. Okay, so I'm just going to warn you, if you got young people, some of these things that going to go over here are maybe a little harsh, just the terrible things that ended up happening. I wanted to bring some light to, just so we realize what kind of bad things have happened. So starting in verse 54. On the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. This is a abomination of desolation. They also burnt altars in the surrounding towns of Judah, and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law they found, they tore to pieces and burnt with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned by death, or condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering, according to the decree. They put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families, and those who circumcised them, they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. Yeah, it's horrific. I mean, just because they had circumcised their kids, they killed them and made them hang their infants around their necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean foods. They chose to die rather than be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. An example of people holding fast to the Torah can be found in 2 Maccabees chapter 6 and 7. I'm going to go over a little bit of 2 Maccabees chapter 6 here, but I'm going to leave 7 to you guys if you want to read it. It's pretty gruesome, but I think it shows us, the faith that we should have in keeping the law. This picture of Antiochus is he was an antichrist. This is, I think, a cycle that we see over and over throughout history. There's an antichrist that comes and profanes basically everything, and that's what we see here. And I think we're going to see this sometime in the future. Don't know how it's going to all play out, but we just have to wait and see. But eventually that will happen, and Yeshua talks about this in, was it Matthew 24, I think. All right. Anyway, getting back to 2 Maccabees, chapter 6. So this is an example of one of the things that had happened. So 2 Maccabees, chapter 6, starting in verse 18. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age, of noble presence, was forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the flesh, as all ought to go who have the courage to refuse things that is not right to taste, even for the natural love of life. So they're killing him because he wasn't eating swine's flesh. That's what they wanted him to do, was eat swine's flesh, and he refused to do it. He held fast to the law, that he wouldn't be defiled. All right, verse 21. Those who were in charge of that unlawful sacrifice took the man aside because of their long acquaintance with him, and privately urged him to bring meat to his own, or of his own providing, proper for him to use, and to pretend that he was eating the flesh of the sacrificial meat that had been commanded by the king, so that by doing this he might be saved from death, and be treated kindly on account of his old friendship with them. But making a high resolve worthy of his years and the dignity of his old age and the gray hairs that he had reached with distinction and his excellent life even from childhood, and moreover according to the holy God-given law, he declared himself, quickly telling them to send him to Hades. So even, they wanted him, they were okay with him eating meat that he was okay with eating, just as long as he publicly made it look like it was swine. So he would end up misleading the people around him. Such pretense is not worthy of our time, he said. For many of the young might suppose that Eleazar in the 19th year had gone over to an alien religion, and through my pretense, for the sake of living a brief moment longer, they would be led astray because of me, while I defile and disgrace my old age. Even if for the present I would avoid the punishment of mortals, yet whether I live or die, I will not escape the hands of the Almighty. Therefore, by bravely giving up my life now, I will show myself worthy of my old age, and leave to the young a noble example of how to die a good death, willing and nobly for the revered and holy laws. When he had said this, he went at once to the rack. Those who a little before had acted towards him with goodwill now changed to ill will, because the words he had uttered were, in their opinion, sheer madness. When he was about to die under the blows, he groaned aloud and said, "It is clear to Jehovah in his holy place, or in his holy knowledge, that though I might have been saved from death, I am enduring terrible sufferings in my body under this beating. But in my soul I am glad to suffer these things because I fear him." So in this way he died, leaving in his death an example of nobility and a memorial of courage, not only to the young, but to the great body of his nation. So, reading this story, I can't help but think of the church of Smyrna, which is mentioned in Revelation 2. So I want to read that real quick. Revelation 2, chapter 10, and chapter 2, verses 10 through 11. "Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you might be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death." So, this is prophetically speaking about what's to come. The tribulation that some people are going to go through. They'll have tribulation for 10 days. And they need to stay faithful till death. We shouldn't be afraid to die, because if we're walking right in his ways and upholding his laws, then we have no fear of the second death, that is after the resurrection. Amen? Amen. All right. Getting back to Maccabees here, or First Maccabees. Starting in chapter 2. So First Maccabees chapter 2. In those days, Mattathias the son of John, son of Simon, a priest of the family of Jorib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. His 5 sons, John surnamed Gadi, Simon called Thassi, Judas called Maccabeus, Eleazar called Alvaron, and Jonathan called Aphius. He saw blasphemous things being committed in Judah and Jerusalem. All right, I just want to say real quick, there is a story a little bit about these brothers being in Jerusalem when that evil guy came and killed a bunch of people, and they fled. So they fled to Modin here. I just wanted to let people know that in 2 Maccabees it talks a little bit about this before they even get to this point. All right, so okay, we're here again. All right, so I'm starting in verse 7. It says, and I'm going to reread 6. He saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem, and said, "Alas, why was I born to see this? The ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live there when I was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to aliens. Her temple has become like a person without honor. Her glorious vessels had been carried into exile. Her infants have been killed in her streets, her youths by the sword of the foe? What nation has not inherited her places and has not seized her spoils? All her adornments have been taken away. No longer free, she became a slave. And see, our holy place, our beauty, and our glory have been laid waste. The Gentiles have profaned them. Why should we live any longer? Then Mattathias and his sons tore their clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned greatly. The king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the town of Modin, and make them offer sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them. Mattathias and his sons were assembled. Then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias and follows, "You are a leader, honored and great in town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the Gentiles and the people of Judah and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and your sons will be honored with silver, gold, and many gifts." But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law of the ordinances, or law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left." When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin. According to the king's command, when Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just like Phinehas did against Zimri, the son of Salu. So, if you don't remember, Phinehas, or Pinchas, I can't remember how to say his name. Phinehas, something like that. That story is found in Numbers chapter 25, and I'm going to read it because I think it's very similar, and I think we can definitely see basically the exact same thing happening. So in Numbers chapter 5, starting at verse 1, it says, "Israel was committing harlotry with the Moabites and Midianites, sacrificing to their gods this righteous..." Oh wait, that's not... You know what? I didn't put it here. I thought I did. I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess if you want to read it, go ahead and read it. I don't actually have it written here. But Israel was committing harlotry with the Moabites and the Midianites, sacrificing to their gods. But this righteous act by Mattathias, or the righteous act of Phinehas at the time, he slayed Zimri. He slayed the people who were making null the law, who were going against Yah's will, and this is what Mattathias had done, and it's what started the revolution. So that was if you want to reread that story, I would recommend reading Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 8. I thought I had written it down here, but I didn't. I apologize for that. And I think you can kind of see the same thing where the Israelites were going astray. They weren't quite maybe as far astray as they were at this point in time during Antiochus's reign, but I think the same thing applies. And by the act of the righteous man with the zeal for Yah, he starts the change, this rebellion. Okay, so continuing in 1 Maccabees, I think chapter 2, starting at verse 27, it says, Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the town. At the time, many who were seeking righteousness and justice went down to the wilderness to live there. They, their sons, their wives, their livestock, because troubles pressed heavily upon them. And it was reported to the king's officers and to the troops in Jerusalem, the city of David, that those who had rejected the king's command had gone down to the hiding places in the wilderness. Many pursued them and overtook them. They encamped opposite them and prepared for battle against them on the Sabbath day. They said to them, "Enough of this. Come out and do what the king commands, and you will live." But they said, "We will not come out, nor will we do what the king commands, and so profane the Sabbath day." Then the enemy quickly attacked them. But they did not answer them or hurl a stone at them or block up their hiding places. For they said, "Let us all die in our innocence. Heaven and earth testify for us, you are killing us unjustly." So they attacked them on the Sabbath, and they died, with their wives and children and livestock, to the number of 1,000 persons. When Mattathias and his friends learned of it, they mourned for them deeply, and all said to their neighbors, "If we all do as our kindred have done and refuse to fight the Gentiles for our lives and for our ordinances, they will quickly destroy us from the earth." So they made the decision that day, "Let's fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our kindred died in their hiding places." So while keeping the Sabbath is a key part of Yah's commandments, so is loving one another and preserving life. Just like it is okay to help the donkey in a ditch, it's okay for us to defend our loved ones. And this is basically what Mattathias had declared. Continuing in verse 42. Then there united with them a company of the Hasidenes, mighty warriors of Israel, all who offered themselves willingly for the law, and all who became fugitives to escape their troubles joined them and reinforced them. They organized an army and struck down sinners in their anger and renegades in their wrath. The survivors fled to the Gentiles for safety. And Mattathias and his friends went around and tore down the altars. They forcibly circumcised all the uncircumcised boys that they found within the borders of Israel. They hunted down the arrogant, and the work prospered in their hands. They rescued the law out of the hands of the Gentiles and kings, and they never let the sinner gain the upper hand. Now the days drew near for Mattathias to die, and he said to his sons, "Arrogance and scorn have now become strong. It is a time of ruin and furious anger. Now, my children, show zeal for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our ancestors. Remember the deeds of the ancestors which they did in their generations, and you will receive great honor and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful when tested, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness? Joseph, in the time of distress, kept the commandments and became Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our ancestor, because he was deeply jealous, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. Joshua, because he filled the command, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, because he testified in the assembly, received the inheritance in the land. David, because he was merciful, inherited the throne of the kingdom forever. Elijah, because of great zeal for the law, was taken up into heaven. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as you might know, believed and were saved from the flame. Daniel, because of his innocence, was delivered from the mouth of the lions. So observe from generation to generation that none of those who put their trust in him will lack strength. Do not fear the words of sinners, for their splendor will turn into dung and worms. Today they will be exalted, but tomorrow they will not be found, because they will have returned to the dust, and their plans will have perished. My children, be courageous and grow strong in the law, for by it you will gain honor. Here is your brother Simon, who I know is wise counsel. Always listen to him. He shall be your father. Judas Maccabeus has been a mighty warrior from his youth. He shall command the army for you and fight the battle against the people. You shall rally around you all who observe the law, and avenge the wrong done to your people. Pay back the Gentiles in full, and obey the commands of the law. Then he blessed them and was gathered to his ancestors. He died in the 146th year and was buried in the tomb of his ancestors at Modin. And all Israel mourned for him with great lamentation. Then his son Judas, who was called Maccabeus, took command in his place, and all his brothers and all who joined his father helped him. They gladly fought for Israel. So, this is where we have the Maccabee story, right? They came together, they upheld the law, they weeded out all the evil ways, they overturned the idols. And under the command here of Maccabeus now, they end up retaking the temple and purifying the temple and taking the land back. And this is where we really get, what we know today, I guess, as Hanukkah, is a remembrance of taking back the temple and rededicating it. So, with that said, there's two different versions of this rededication of the temple, one in 2nd Maccabees and one in 1st Maccabees. And I'm going to read the one first in 2nd Maccabees, starting in chapter 10, verses 1 through 8. It says, Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple and the city. They tore down the altars that had been built in the public square by the foreigners. They also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices. After a lapse of 2 years, they offered incense, lighted lamps, and set out the bread of the presence. When they had done this, they fell prostrate and implored Jehovah that they might never fall into such misfortunes, but that if they should ever sin, they might be disciplined by him with forbearance and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened that on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place. That is, on the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev, they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing, in the manner of the festival of the booths, or Sukkot. Remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, or Sukkot, they have been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns and thanksgiving to him, who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these events every year. So we see the rededication here. They had to rebuild the things that were corrupted. They tore down the altar and replaced the altar. They rebuilt up the temple, and they then rededicated it by basically a Feast of Booths or Sukkot ceremony. And we'll see in, I don't think I actually have it written here, but every time the altar has been dedicated, it has been with the Feast of Sukkot. It's the same rituals and stuff that they do, the same following. So I think it's interesting here that, they say, while it's the wrong day, they say the 25th of Kislev versus, in the 7th month and the 15th day when Sukkot happens, they recall when they were in the wilderness, they were wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals, celebrating, like that's what they were doing during the festival of Sukkot. And, today we tend to go camping out in the mountains because there is no temple in Jerusalem per se that we are called to go. So in a way, we are like they were before they got the temple back, and celebrating and how we celebrate it. All right, now I'm going to read 1 Maccabees chapter 4, verses 36 through 59. This is the first Maccabees version of what was just read in the second Maccabees, but it's more thorough, so I want to read it. Then Judas and his brothers said, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up and cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. Then they tore their clothes and mourned with great lamentation. They sprinkled themselves with ashes, and they fell face down on the ground. And when the signal was given with the trumpets, they cried out to heaven. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering, which had been profaned, and they thought it best to tear it down, so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet would come to tell them what to do with them. Then they took unhewn stones as the law directs, and built a new altar like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Then they offered incense on the altar and lit the lampstand and gave light in the temple. These gave light in the temple. They placed the bread on the table and hung up the curtains. Thus they finished all the work that they had undertaken. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 108th year, they rose and offered sacrifice, as the law directs, on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with song and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven, who had prospered them. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings. They offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. They decorated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They restored the gates and the chambers for the priests and fitted them with doors. There was very great joy among the people, and the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that at that season the day of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev. So this here is the reason Hanukkah is celebrated today. Even through great oppression and seemingly impossible odds, through the acts of Yah's righteous followers, Yah restored his temple to his people, those willing to stand up for his commandments and his ways. I think a big takeaway from this story is that it shows us how easily that the people turned away from Yah and his commandments. Some were enticed by just the desires of the flesh, while others did it to save their flesh. Yet there were those righteous few that were willing to stand up for Yah's commandments. To those, I'm sure they will have great reward. And the corruption that occurred didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages so that the people would gradually be influenced. And corruption bred corruption, more corruption. We see this over and over again throughout history. It first started with the simple mixing of custom and traditions. This is meant to get the people complacent and give them desires of the flesh. This is the road that leads people to forget about, everything is good, life is great. Why do we need to worship Yah? They slowly, as this happened and the people became complacent, they slowly, more and more people turned their back to Yah, in turn, which then in turn turns into forced rejection of Yah's commandments. So while there's still a remnant that remembers Yah and wants to observe his commandments, the law of the land will change. The law of the land did change for these people, in which they were forced to reject Yah's commandments and do outright idol worship. The first Hanukkah was the purging of all these pagan practices, returning to Yah and rejoicing in his ways and his commandments. Through this story, we also see that things all went downhill after the priesthood itself got corrupted. When Jason bought the position of high priest, and later Menelaus usurped that position through more bribery, corruption begets corruption. When an unrighteous person is put in the place of power and influence, how quickly things can go downhill. Thankfully, today, we have Yeshua, who is our high priest, so we don't worry about him being corrupted. Hebrews 5, chapter 5, verses 9 and 10 say, "And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by Elohim as high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek." So we have no worry of Yeshua being corrupted. He is who we put our trust in. He is who we follow after. And he is also the light that guides our path. Yeshua himself said, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." With this talk about light, Hanukkah was also known as the Festival of Lights. Traditionally, it's a time when the Jews light the Hanukkah, which is the 9-light lamp. Now, these are some of the oldest Hanukkah type things I've found, and you'll notice that this one doesn't look like a menorah. This is from the 14th century, so it's not that old, but it is old by today's standards. This was found in France. And you'll see there's 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 9. And here we have some more. These are found, they date back to the 15th century. And you'll notice they don't carry the look of what we kind of see in modern day Hanukkahs. They have the eight lights, and one that's separate. Now, I don't know about this one here because there's only 8 holes for the lamps or the lights up there. I'm not sure if this is meant to be the 9th or not, but this is what was found in Jerusalem, and they date it back to like the 15th century. So while not old, while old, it's not that old, really. So I'm not sure when exactly this 8-candle lamp started, but it was probably quite a while back. Let's see.
Makes me wonder if they were celebrating the festival of lights or the dedication of the temple, similar to how you celebrate Sukkot. How come this same candle pattern didn't pop up for Sukkot? So it's probably more so because it's the tradition of men.
Yeah, this is really a tradition. These 8 lights are for the 8 days. They traditionally represent the 8 days of Hanukkah. I mean, the 9th light is the shamash, the servant candle, and this is kind of what we see traditionally today is your modern day Hanukkah that looks like a menorah, but they've added an extra branch that has 2 lights, so that it is not a Hanukkah or a menorah. And this goes because the rabbis, they decreed that you can't have a menorah in your house. You can't make a likeness of the menorah, but it's okay to make something that's different. In olden times, we just see this, where we have 8 lights. So we don't even have the menorah shape. It's just interesting that like even this has changed over the years as Hanukkah has been celebrated. Now, you guys probably have heard about the miracle of oil, which is the popular reason for Hanukkah. They say that the miracle of oil, when Judas Maccabee took the temple back and they went to rededicate the temple, they only found one cruse of oil that had been undefiled, and that cruse was only enough to light the menorah for one day, but instead it burned for 8 days. From what we read in Maccabees, that this so-called miracle, didn't happen. Maybe it happened, but it's not documented in the book of Maccabees. And from reading the book of Maccabees, it seems like they had a bit of time before the 25th actually happened to clean things up, to get the temple ready. They rebuilt the altar. They took care of some other things before they actually dedicated the altar. So, it would lead one to think that maybe they would have prepared the menorah and made sure they would have had the oil, but I don't know. The oldest instance of this miracle of oil that is talked about today can be found in Megillat Antiochus. This dates back to 200 AD. So, this is 300 or so years after the events happened. And I'm going to read it just so you know what it says. The Hasmoneans entered the sanctuary, rebuilt the gates, closed the breaches, and cleansed the temple court from the slain and the impurities. They looked for pure olive oil to light the menorah and found only one bottle with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, so that they were sure of its purity, though its quantity seemed sufficient only for 1 day's lighting. It lasted for 8 days, owing to the blessing of Elohim of heaven, who established his name there. Hence the Hasmoneans and all the Jews alike instituted these 8 days as a time of feasting and rejoicing, like any festival prescribed in the Torah, and of kindling lights to commemorate the victories of Elohim, or commemorate the victories Elohim had given them. So this is the oldest mention of the miracle of oil that I could find. Yet all older sources that mention Hanukkah make no mention of the miracle of oil. Just like I said, like we read in the book of Maccabees, there is no mention of the miracle of oil. Now, Josephus talks about Hanukkah as well. And he makes a comment regarding why it's called the Festival of Lights. And it says, and this is in Josephus, where is this? Josephus, book 12, chapter 7. I'm going to read verse 325. And from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and call it Lights. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that hence was the name given to that festival. So I'm not saying that it's kind of weird why Josephus comments on the lights. Yeah, he doesn't mention the miracle of oil, but he may have written this because he was under Roman influence. He didn't want the Romans to, be weary of what might happen. And the miracle of oil was this miracle that only Yah could do. And maybe he just didn't want to scare the Romans. So that may be one reason why he wrote it like this, but it's kind of odd why he would talk about lights and not mention the miracle of oil. So I'm not saying that the miracle of oil didn't happen, because that is definitely within Yah's power. We even have the story of Elisha and the widow, with the widow's oil being multiplied. So it's not something new that we would have seen if that's what happened. So while there is good symbology that comes from lights, we need to be careful how we practice the traditions. One of the primary blessings that's actually recited during the lighting of Hanukkah lights is, "Blessed are you, Adonai, our Elohim, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to kindle the Hanukkah lights." So in this blessing, it's saying that Yah has commanded us to kindle the Hanukkah lights, in which there is no such commandment. Yah never gave such a commandment to kindle the Hanukkah lights. So by saying this blessing, we're agreeing that the rabbis have power to make new commandments, adding to the word of Yah, something explicitly forbidden in the Torah, Deuteronomy 4:2. You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yehovah your Elohim, which I command you. So, if you're going to do the lighting of the menorah, I think it's a fine thing. There's things we can remember, and I'm going to go into some little things about it too, and how it symbolizes Yeshua and things like that. Just be careful of what blessings and things you do, what other traditions you do, because saying a blessing like this, I think, is putting words in Yah's mouth, and that's not something we want to do. Another tradition is eating fried foods to commemorate the miracle of oil. I don't really see anything wrong with this, other than maybe it's just not great for your health. It's, we shouldn't be eating all deep fried foods all for our meals, but, So, yeah. Enjoy it in moderation, I would say. All right, and then another tradition that we see are the dreidels. Tradition states that during Antiochus' fourth reign, when studying Torah was banned, the Jews would study anyway, but at the first sign of any Greek officials approaching, they would hide their Torah scrolls and replace it with the dreidel, which was, at the time, spinning top games were a common way to gamble. So the Greek officials would just think they were gambling, doing something that they approved of, not studying the Torah. And the dreidel has the letters Nun, Gimel, Hey, and Shin on it. And the Nun stands for the Yiddish word nisht, nothing. Hey stands for halb, half. Gimel stands for all, or ganz, all. And Shin stands for shitel ayin, put in. That's just how kind of give you an idea how to play the game. But so those letters are also stand for words. And the common one is Nes Gadol Haya Sham, which means a great miracle happened there. So if we have a dreidel outside of Israel, that's what it should say. It should have the Nun, Gimel, Hey, and Shin on it, because a great miracle happened there. But dreidels inside of Israel replace the letter of Shin with the letter of Pei, which says Nes Gadol Haya Pei, or Po. A great miracle happened here, which is kind of neat. We actually have different dreidels depending on where we're located. Now, getting back to the lights of Hanukkah, or Hanukkah specifically, I want to just talk quickly like how it's lit, right? We use traditionally you use the shamash, which is in this particular instance it's the center candle to light the other ones. Let's see, where was I here? So we can see this ninth holder being a picture of Yeshua because he's the servant. Just because this may be a man-made tradition doesn't mean Yah can't use it to his glory. Just like we saw with the water libation ceremony during Sukkot, I think we see it here with Hanukkah. So Mark chapter 10, verse 45 says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." He was the suffering servant also, Isaiah 53. So in this case, we can see how the shamash candle, the helper or the servant, can point to Yeshua. Yeshua himself said, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." So, with the shamash, we light the other candles. Traditionally, right to left, we light the candles. And depending on the day, you add another candle. There's some arguments of how you're supposed to light, or how many lights you're supposed to light. Some say you light the 2 for the second day, 3 for the third day, and so on and so forth, till you get to 8 days. And others say it's the other way around. And you might ask, way around, why 8 days first and then you go down? And that has to do with the number of sacrifices of bulls, I think, that were offered during Sukkot. It went backwards. So that would be an argument for why you would do it the other way around. Or, there's nothing saying you have to light only one. You could light all 8 days. There's nothing saying that you can't do that. Well, maybe there is something, but that's just rabbinic tradition. Okay. How am I doing? Okay. Let's see. I want to read 1 John 1:9, continuing with this picture of Yeshua being the light. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was Elohim." Or Word was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim. "He was in the beginning with Elohim. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not the light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world." So when you're lighting the Hanukkah lamp with your shamash, you're spreading the light of Yeshua to the world. I think we can see that symbology. We can also take the servant candle personally as well, where we are the servant. In 1 Corinthians 6:19, it says, "Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from Elohim? You are not your own." So we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Our bodies are the temple. And Yeshua's light should shine in us the menorah shines in the temple. In John 15, verses 4 through 5 say, "Abide in me, and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bear much fruit, for without me you can do nothing." And 2 Corinthians 4:6, "For it is the Elohim who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of knowledge of the glory of Elohim in the face of Yeshua Messiah." And Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So Yeshua lives in us, and we are not to hide it, but to show the world. Just as the Hanukkah tradition goes, to put the lamp near a window so others can see. Be a witness to Yeshua, and through that bring glory to the Father in heaven. Amen? So whether or not you decide to light the Hanukkah this Hanukkah is up to you. This is a man-made tradition, and the feast is not one of the commanded feasts. But I do think the Feast of Dedication should have a special place in our heart. Even Yeshua went up to the temple during the Feast of Dedication, and that's mentioned in John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23. It says, "Now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. And Yeshua walked in the temple and saw the porch." It doesn't really say what, like if he was observing this feast or if he's just there, but he was there. It does say he went up there, and the Feast of Dedication happens in winter. They were practicing this feast at the time of Yeshua. And Yeshua doesn't openly speak negative about it either. So I think it's safe to say he was okay with it. In fact, it commemorates him in a way. There are a lot of people who believe that Yeshua was born on tabernacles. And if he was born on tabernacles, 9 months or so, 9.5 months before that would be this Feast of Dedication, which is interesting to think about. Perhaps this was his conception date. We don't know. But there are a lot of people who believe that, and it's kind of interesting. We have these traditions of light. It's a festival of lights, him bringing light into the world. So in his conception, light is being brought into the world. The 24th of Kislev was actually also the date that the cornerstone for the second temple was put into place. So, we also have that happen. So we have the 24th, and then we have the 25th, which, first we have the cornerstone put in place, and we have this Feast of Dedication, which is interesting how it all kind of lines up. And if you want to read a little bit about the cornerstone being set in place, that's in Haggai chapter 2. It kind of all talks, that whole chapter kind of talks a little bit about that. All right, so for Hanukkah, I think we should take the opportunity to rededicate ourselves. If there's any pagan influences we are falling under, it's time to separate ourselves from them, to be made holy, to be set apart, dedicated to Yah's ways and commandments. This is why I find it so sad when we see pagan traditions actually creeping into Hanukkah. It's missing what I believe is the point of the Feast of Dedication or Hanukkah. And unfortunately, the miracle of oil, I think, has become a distraction to Hanukkah. And people are forgetting what started the loss of the temple in the first place, the falling away and letting, incorporating the ways of the pagans that shouldn't be. So with that said, with that, that goes with 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, which says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of Elohim abides forever." So the people loving the ways of the world and trying to incorporate them in a Hanukkah, please stop that. And you take that out of Hanukkah because that doesn't really belong there. And I'll end with this. As the holiday season is upon us, we see more and more pagan influences around us. We need to keep ourselves separate from them so that we may be a light to the world. And regardless, remember to always show others love. If we have the opportunity to bring light to pagan practices of loved ones, do it with love, regardless. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3. "Though I speak with tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understanding all mysteries, all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." So always show love to one another, that we might win them over to Yeshua, and that they might come to a full understanding. Amen? Amen. Shabbat Shalom. Hope this teaching blessed you. And have a blessed week.